Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you find value in what we explore here together. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. These long-form explorations take time to craft, and your engagement genuinely helps. Now, silence your phone, find a comfortable position, and let's descend into a story that begins not in a nightclub, not in a warehouse rave, but in a pristine laboratory in Imperial Germany, where a chemist was simply trying to solve a problem that had nothing whatsoever to do with love, empathy, or dancing until dawn. The year was 1912. The place, Darmstadt, Germany. A city of ordered streets and precise minds, home to the pharmaceutical giant Merck. The company that would one day become a global behemoth was then a respected chemical manufacturer, still carrying the legacy of its 17th century apothecary origins. In one of their laboratories, a chemist named Anton Kurisch was engaged in what seemed like routine pharmaceutical research. He was not chasing enlightenment or attempting to unlock the doors of perception. He was working on something far more prosaic, a potential blood-clotting agent. The Imperial German military was interested in anything that could help soldiers survive the increasingly mechanized warfare that was brewing on the horizon. Merck had assigned Kurisch to synthesize compounds that might act as heatic agents, substances to stop bleeding. He was exploring derivatives of saffron, a naturally occurring compound found in sassafras oil, which was used in everything from root beer flavoring to perfume. Through a careful series of reactions, amination here, methylation there, Kurisch created a new molecule. He called it, in the systematic nomenclature of organic chemistry, 3A4-methyl-anidiomethamphetamine. The synthesis was completed on December 24, 1912, an ironic Christmas gift to a world that had no idea what it had just received. Merck filed a patent for the compound, Patent 274350, not because they thought it was revolutionary, but because that's what pharmaceutical companies did. They filed patents on everything, building libraries of molecules that might someday prove useful. The patent described the synthesis process in meticulous detail, but it said almost nothing about what the compound actually did. There were no human trials, no animal studies documented, no exploration of its effects. It was simply recorded, cataloged, and filed away in the company's archives. For all practical purposes, MDMA, the molecule that would one day be known as Ecstasy, Molly, the love drug, was born and then immediately forgotten, a chemical orphan sleeping in the pages of a German patent file. The world moved on. The Great War came and went, consuming a generation in the trenches. The Roaring Twenties arrived with their own preferred intoxicants, gin and jazz. The Great Depression ground economies to dust. Another war, more terrible than the first, engulfed the planet. Through it all, MDMA remained in its paper prison, unknown and unexplored. Merck, like all companies, had more pressing concerns. The compound that Kurisch had created was neither a blood clot nor anything else they could identify as commercially useful. It was a molecular dead end. But in the world of chemistry and pharmacology, nothing stays buried forever. The post-war era brought a new kind of scientist, funded by new kinds of money, asking new kinds of questions. The Cold War was not just a military and political contest. It was a psychological one, and the human mind, with all its vulnerabilities and potential, had become a battlefield. In the 1950s, the United States military and intelligence agencies, particularly the Central Intelligence Agency, became deeply interested in what they called behavior modification. The Korean War had produced disturbing reports of American PS who had been brainwashed by their communist captives returning home spouting Marxist ideology. Whether these reports were accurate or exaggerated, they terrified the intelligence establishment. If the enemy had developed techniques to control minds, then America needed the same capability, or better yet, a countermeasure. This paranoia gave birth to one of the darkest chapters in American scientific history, Project MK Ultra. MK Ultra was an umbrella program encompassing hundreds of clandestine experiments conducted on unwitting subjects, prisoners, mental patients, prostitutes, and even CIA employees themselves. The goal was to find drugs and techniques that could be used for interrogation to break down a subject's resistance, to extract information, or to create compliant agents. The CIA researchers, working through a network of universities and private contractors to maintain plausible deniability, tested an astonishing array of substances: LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, barbiturates, amphetamines, and dozens of obscure synthetic compounds. It was in this context that MDMA was pulled from obscurity. The exact circumstances remain murky. Classified documents, partially destroyed in the 1970s, before congressional investigators could examine them. But we know that in 1953 and 1954, the U.S. Army conducted toxicity studies on MDMA at the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, a facility dedicated to chemical warfare research. The tests were conducted on animals, primarily rats, dogs, and monkeys. The Army researchers were not interested in the compound's emotional effects. They were looking for something that could incapacitate, interrogate, or kill. The results were recorded in dry clinical language. The compound showed low toxicity at moderate doses, some behavioral changes in test animals, but nothing that suggested it would be useful as a truth serum or incapacitating agent. Once again, MDMA was deemed uninteresting. The reports were filed away, stamped with security classifications, and forgotten. MDMA had now been discovered twice and dismissed twice. It would take a third discovery, this one by a man who was not interested in warfare or interrogation, but in the human soul itself, to finally unlock the molecule's true nature. Alexander Theodor Shulgin was not a typical chemist. Born in 1925 in Berkeley, California, to Russian immigrant parents, he served in the Navy during World War II and then pursued chemistry at UC Berkeley, earning his PhD in biochemistry from the University of California in 1954. He took a job at Dow Chemical, where he quickly made his mark by developing a commercially successful insecticide called Zectran. The compound earned Dow millions, and in return, they granted Shulgin something almost unheard of in corporate research: complete freedom. He could pursue any line of inquiry that interested him with minimal oversight. It was a golden cage, and for a while it suited him perfectly. But Shulgin's interests had taken a turn inward. In the late 1950s, he had his first experience with mescaline, the psychoactive alkaloid found in pote cactus. The experience was, in his words, transformative. He described it as opening a door in his mind that he hadn't known existed, revealing a landscape of consciousness that was profoundly meaningful. He became convinced that psychoactive compounds were not simply drugs in the recreational or medical sense. They were tools, technologies for exploring the human psyche. He left Dow in the late 1960s. burned out by the politics and constraints of corporate life, and set up a private laboratory behind his home in the hills of Lafayette, California. Shulgin was that rarest of creatures, a brilliant chemist with a mystical streak, a man who could synthesize complex molecules with precision while also being deeply interested in their subjective phenomenological effects. He held a Schedule I license from the DEA, which legally allowed him to synthesize and research controlled substances. He worked as a consultant for law enforcement, helping them identify new street drugs, which gave him both cover and credibility. But his real work, his passion, was synthesis and self-experimentation. He was part chemist, part psychonaut, part philosopher. He and his wife, Anne Shulgin, a therapist with a deep interest in consciousness, would synthesize a new compound in the lab, and then with meticulous care and appropriate precautions, they would ingest it themselves. They would document the experience, the dosage, the duration, the subjective effects, the insights gained or the discomfort endured. They enlisted a small circle of trusted friends, what Shulgin called his research group, to help map the effects of new compounds. It was a practice that would horrify modern institutional review boards, but in the freewheeling early 1970s, it was Shulgin's method, and it worked. Shulgin was not the first to resynthesize MDMA. The exact provenance is contested, but he certainly became its most important advocate and researcher. He had come across references to the compound in the old Merck patent and in the classified Army reports, which had by then been partially declassified or leaked. Intrigued by its structural similarity to other amphetamines and psychedelics he had studied, Shulgin synthesized MDMA in his lab in 1965 or 1976. Accounts vary. He did not ingest it immediately. He was cautious, methodical. He worked through lower doses, observing effects in himself and his research group. What he found astonished him. MDMA was unlike anything he had encountered. It was not a traditional psychedelic like LSD or psilocybin. There were no intense visual hallucinations, no dissolution of the ego into cosmic unity, no sense of confronting the vast alien intelligence of the universe. Instead, MDMA produced something far more subtle, and in Shulgin's view, far more valuable. It created a state of profound emotional openness and empathy. Anxiety dissolved, defensive psychological barriers softened. People felt a deep sense of connection to themselves and to others. Past traumas could be examined without overwhelming fear or pain. It was as if the compound had turned down the volume on the brain's fear response while turning up the emotional warmth and introspection. Shulgin called it a window, where classical psychedelics were like opening a door into a completely alien landscape of consciousness. MDMA was like opening a window into your own psyche, allowing you to see yourself clearly, with compassion rather than judgment. He began to share it carefully with select therapists he knew and trusted. This was not recreational distribution. This was an attempt to introduce a tool that he believed could revolutionize psychotherapy. One of the therapists who took up MDMA with particular enthusiasm was a man named Leo Z. Z was a semi-retired psychologist from Oakland, California. A bear of a man with a white beard and a gentle manner. Someone who looked like he should be teaching at a university or leading a meditation retreat. In the 1960s, Z had been trained in the use of LSD for psychotherapy before it was criminalized. When that door closed, he had reluctantly retired. But when Shulgin introduced him to MDMA in 1977, Z saw a second chance. He called MDMA Adam, a reference to the biblical figure's state of innocence before the fall, a state of pure openness before shame and fear entered the world. Leo Zeff became a missionary for MDMA-assisted therapy. Over the next several years, he traveled extensively, training hundreds of therapists across the United States and in Europe in the careful, ethical use of MDMA as a therapeutic adjunct. These were licensed psychologists, psychiatrists, and counselors, serious professionals who saw MDMA not as a party drug, but as a medicine. The protocol was careful. Screening of patients, preparation sessions to set intention, administration of a moderate dose of pure MDMA in a safe, comfortable setting, hours of therapeutic conversation while the drug took effect, and then integration sessions afterward to process the insights gained. The reports were remarkable. Therapists described breakthroughs with patients who had been stuck for years. PTSD sufferers who could finally talk about their trauma without being overwhelmed by it. Couples in failing marriages who could express their feelings without defensiveness and anger. Rediscovering empathy and connection. Individuals who suffered from deep-seated shame or self-loathing, who could, for a few hours, experience self-compassion. It was not a magic cure. The therapeutic work still had to be done. The insight still had to be integrated into daily life. But MDMA seemed to open a doorway, making therapeutic progress possible in hours that might otherwise have taken. For years of conventional talk therapy, for a brief, shining moment, there existed an underground network of MDMA-assisted therapy operating in a legal gray zone. MDMA was not yet a scheduled substance. It was technically legal, if largely unknown to the general public and to drug enforcement agencies. Shulgin Z and their network of therapist collaborators believed they were pioneering a new era of psychiatric treatment. They published papers, though often under pseudonyms or in obscure journals to avoid drawing attention. They were careful, or so they thought, but word was spreading beyond the therapeutic community. In the early 1980s, MDMA began to leak into the recreational world. Exactly how this happened is disputed. A mix of therapists who are less discreet, patients who shared their experiences with friends, and enterprising individuals who saw commercial potential. What is certain is that by 1983 and 1984, MDMA had arrived in the nightlife scene, particularly in Dallas. Of all places, a group of entrepreneurs, most notably a man named Michael Clay, began manufacturing and distributing MDMA under the brand name Ecstasy. The choice of name was brilliant marketing. It promised pleasure, transcendence, a superlative experience. Clay and his associates were not street-level drug dealers. They were businessmen. They sold MDMA openly in bars and clubs, marketing it as a legal high. Because it was still legal, there was no need for the furtive handoffs of the cocaine or heroin trade. You could buy ecstasy like you bought a drink, and it was advertised quite literally with flyers and word of mouth as a drug that would make you feel love, connection, and euphoria. The dose was typically around 100 to 120 milliliters, enough to produce strong effects without being overwhelming. The Dallas scene exploded. Clubs that had been languishing suddenly had lines around the block. People who had never been interested in legal drugs, lawyers, doctors, college students, professionals, were trying ecstasy. They would take it, dance for hours, hug strangers, have deep conversations, and wake up the next day with a sense of having experienced something profound. It was the recreational use of a therapeutic compound. And while some in Schulin's circle were horrified by this development, Others were more sanguine, believing that even recreational users were benefiting from the empathy and openness MDMA provided. But this golden era was about to come to a crashing halt. The visibility of ecstasy, its open sale, and the media's growing interest had drawn the attention of the one entity that Shulin and his colleagues had most feared, the Drug Enforcement Administration. The DEA had been watching. In the early 1980s, as MDMA spread from therapeutic circles into nightclubs, reports began to filter up through the AY's intelligence network. Local police in Dallas and other cities were noting the presence of a new drug being sold openly. The media, always hungry for a new drug panic story, began to publish sensationalistic cases about the yuppie psychedelic and the love drug. By 1984, the agency felt it had seen enough. In July 1984, Senator Lloyd Bentsen of Texas, responding to constituent concerns about the drug's proliferation in Dallas clubs, wrote to the DEA demanding action. The agency did not need much prompting. On July 27, 1984, the DEA announced its intention to place MDMA into Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act using an emergency scheduling procedure. Schedule 1 is the most restrictive category, reserved for drugs deemed to have a high potential for abuse, no currently accepted medical use, and a lack of accepted safety for use under medical supervision. It is the same category as heroin, LSD, and marijuana. The announcement sent waves through the therapeutic community. Dozens of therapists who had been quietly using MDMA in their practice were suddenly faced with a crisis. Many of them decided to come out of the shadows and fight. A psychiatrist named Rick Doblin, who had personally experienced profound benefit from MDMA-assisted therapy and who had a background in public policy, founded an organization called the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, specifically to challenge the DEA's scheduling decision. Alongside researchers, therapists, and attorneys, Doblin argued that the DEA was acting precipitously, ignoring evidence of MDMA's therapeutic potential, and that it should be placed in the less restrictive Schedule 3, which would allow for continued medical research and supervised therapeutic use. Administrative hearings were held. The DEA was required by law to hold these hearings before finalizing the schedule on classification. Over several months in 1985, the two sides purr their cases before DEA Administrative Law Judge Francis Young. The therapeutic community brought forward therapists who testified about the positive outcomes they had witnessed in their patients. They presented written case studies, though many details had to be anonymized to protect patient confidentiality. They argued that MDMA had a low potential for abuse when used in controlled settings, that it had clear therapeutic applications, and that banning it entirely would halt promising research and deny patients a valuable treatment option. The DEA, for its part, presented evidence of recreational use, reports of emergency room visits related to MDMA use, though these were relatively rare, and testimony from toxicologists about the compound's similarity to other amphetamines, which were known to be neurotoxic at high doses. They argued that once a drug entered recreational circulation, it was impossible to contain, that the therapeutic use was a fig leaf for what was essentially drug abuse, and that the government had a responsibility to protect the public from potentially dangerous substances. Judge Francis Young, after reviewing the evidence, issued a remarkable ruling in May 1986. He recommended that MDMA be placed in Schedule 3, not Schedule Y. In his detailed opinion, He wrote that the evidence for therapeutic use was credible and compelling, that the compound did not have the high abuse potential characteristic of scheduled drugs, and that there was no evidence of significant physical or psychological harm when used in controlled therapeutic contexts. It was a victory for Doplin and the therapeutic community, a rare instance of a government official acknowledging the potential value of a psychoactive substance. But it was a short-lived victory. The DA is not bound by the recommendations of its own administrative law judges. The final decision rested with administrator of the DEA, and in an unprecedented move, the agency rejected Judge Young's recommendation outright. On March 23, 1988, despite the legal and scientific arguments presented, the DEA finalized MDMA's placement in Schedule 1. The official explanation cited concerns about neurotoxicity and abuse potential, though many observers saw it as a political decision driven by the broader war on drugs mentality of the Reagan era. The therapeutic community was devastated overnight. The use of MDMA in therapy became a federal crime. Therapists who had been pioneering this work were forced to stop or risk prosecution, loss of their medical licenses, and imprisonment. Research ground to a halt. Shulgin, who had been so careful, so methodical, saw his life's work criminalized. The window he had discovered was officially closed. But the DEA's decision had an unintended consequence, one that would shape the next 3 decades of MDMA's history. By banning the drug entirely and it into the black market, they ensured that MDMA would no longer be the province of careful therapists administering measured doses in safe settings. It would become the domain of underground chemists, smugglers, and a new global subculture that was just beginning to coalesce around a revolutionary new form of music and communal experience. The government had closed the therapeutic window, but in doing so, it had flung open the doors of the club. To understand how ecstasy became the defining drug of a generation, you must first understand the rave. The rave was not just a party. It was a cultural phenomenon, a movement, a collective rejection of the mainstream, and an embrace of something new. Something that felt to its participants like a glimpse of utopia. The story begins in the mid-1980s in the industrial cities of America and Europe, places where the old manufacturing economy had collapsed, leaving behind vast warehouses, abandoned factories, and a generation of young people. Limited economic prospects, but unlimited creative energy. In Chicago, DJs were creating a new form of electronic dance music called house, named after the warehouse club where it was born. In Detroit, it was techno, a harder, more mechanical sound that reflected the decay of the Motor City. In the UK, particularly in Manchester and London, acid house emerged, a hypnotic, repetitive style that was perfect for long nights of dancing. The music was one element, the setting was another. Raves were illegal, unlicensed parties held in spaces that were never meant for such gatherings. Empty warehouses, aircraft hangars, open fields, abandoned industrial sites. The locations were secret, spread by word of mouth or cryptic flyers revealed only at the last minute. This was not a coincidence. The illegality was part of the appeal. Raves existed outside the normal structures of society, outside the control of authorities, outside the judgment of the mainstream. They were autonomous zones, temporary utopias where different rules applied. And then there was ecstasy. The drug and the rave culture grew up together, each amplifying the other in a symbiotic relationship. MDMA was the perfect chemical companion for the rave experience. The music, with its repetitive beats, its build-ups and drops, its layers of sound, became profoundly moving under the influence of MDMA. The sensory experience was enhanced. Touch felt electric. Lights and lasers created mesmerizing patterns. But more than the sensory enhancement, MDMA provided the emotional glue that held the rave culture together. Ecstasy dissolved social barriers. At a rave, the hierarchies of the outside world, class, race, background fell away. Strangers became friends. The competitive, individualistic ethos of daily life was replaced, at least for a night, with a sense of collective joy and unity. People spoke of the vibe, a shared emotional state that seemed to envelop the entire crowd. It was the sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than yourself. For young people who felt alienated by the materialism and cynicism of the late 20th century, the rave offered an alternative vision, a community based on love, acceptance, and shared ecstatic experience. The phrase peace, love, unity, respect, often abbreviated as PLUR, became the unofficial motto of rave culture. It was sincere, almost naively so. Ravers genuinely believed they were creating a new kind of society, one that rejected violence, embraced diversity, and prioritized collective happiness over individual gain. And for many, at least during those long nights of dancing, it felt true. The culture spread like wildfire. From the UK, where the Second Summer of Love in 1988 or 89 saw massive outdoor raves drawing tens of thousands, to Europe, where the techno scene in Berlin became a symbol of post-Cold War liberation, to the United States, where rave culture took root in cities like New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. By the mid-1990s, raves were a global phenomenon, and ecstasy was everywhere. But the drug was no longer what Schulin had synthesized in his lab, or what the therapeutic community had carefully administered. The black market had taken over, and with it came all the problems of prohibition. MDMA production moved underground and overseas. The precursor chemicals needed to synthesize MDMA saffron primarily were controlled but not impossible to obtain. Clandestine labs sprang up, first in the Netherlands and Belgium, which had sophisticated chemical industries and relatively lenient drug enforcement, and later in Eastern Europe and Canada. These underground chemists were not pharmaceutical-grade manufacturers. Quality control was inconsistent at best, non-existent at worst. Pills sold as ecstasy might contain MDMA, or they might contain a cocktail of other substances, MDA, a closely related but more neurotoxic compound, methamphetamine, caffeine, ephedrine, or any number of research chemicals and adulterants. Some pills contained no MDMA at all, just cheap stimulants pressed into tablets and stamped with a logo. The famous ecstasy logos, the Mitsubishi Triple Diamonds, the Rolex Crown, the smiley face, were no guarantee of quality. They were branding easily copied by any operation with a pill press. This adulteration created real dangers. Users had no way of knowing what they were actually ingesting or at what dose. People who thought they were taking 100 molins of pure MDMA might actually be taking 200 mol of a poorly synthesized batch mixed with methamphetamine. The inconsistency led to unpredictable effects and inevitably to medical emergencies. And yet, the vast majority of users had positive experiences, or at least experiences positive enough to keep coming back. Ecstasy, even in its adulterated black market form, delivered something that millions of people wanted: A few hours of profound emotional connection, a release from anxiety and self-consciousness, a sense of joy and unity. It was the fuel for one of the largest youth movements in history. Governments predictably responded with alarm. In the UK, the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994 was passed specifically to crack down on raves, giving police new powers to shut down unlicensed gatherings and confiscate sound equipment. In the US, the Rave Act was proposed in 2002, later incorporated into the Protect Act of 2003, which allowed property owners to be prosecuted if drug use occurred on their premises, effectively making it legally dangerous to host large electronic music events. These laws drove rave culture further underground or forced it to become commercialized, moving into licensed clubs and festivals where it could be monitored and controlled. The media, meanwhile, engaged in their usual cycle of moral panic. Every tragic death associated with ecstasy use became poor news. And there were deaths, not many relative to the millions using the drug, but each one was a tragedy. Most were not caused by MDMA's inherent toxicity, but by a combination of factors: dehydration and overheating from dancing for hours in hot, crowded spaces without adequate water, hyponatria or water intoxication from drinking too much water in response to overheating warnings, adulterants in pills, pre-existing medical conditions like heart defects, or tragically, the use of ecstasy in combination with other drugs or alcohol. The death in 1995 of Leah Betts, an 18-year-old British girl who died after taking ecstasy at a party, became a focal point for anti-drug campaigning in the UK. Leah's death was particularly tragic because it was caused by hyponatria. She had been warned about dehydration and drank several liters of water in a short period, diluting her blood sodium to dangerous levels. The anti-drug campaign that followed featured a haunting photograph of Leah in a picture, incubated in a hospital bed. It was plastered on billboards and in newspapers with the slogan, "Sorted just one ecstasy tablet took Liebitz." The campaign ignored the complexities of her death, the role of water intoxication rather than the drug itself. And it certainly didn't engage with the fact that millions of young people were using ecstasy without dying. It was simplistic fear-mongering, but it was effective in shaping public perception. What was lost in the noise of moral panic and law enforcement crackdowns was any serious public health approach to harm reduction. Organizations like Dance Safe in the US and The Loop in the UK attempted to fill the gap, offering drug testing services at festivals and clubs, distributing information about safe use, and advocating for practical measures like access to free water and cool-down spaces. But they operated in a legal gray area, often facing opposition from authorities who believed that harm reduction sent the wrong message by accepting drug use. By the late 1990s, rave culture had fragmented. The massive illegal warehouse parties became rarer, replaced by commercialized mega-festivals like Tomorrowland in Belgium and the Electric Daisy Carnival in the US. Electronic dance music, or EDM, became a billion-dollar industry. DJs became international superstars, playing to stadium-sized crowds, and ecstasy remained a central, if now more controversial, part of the experience. But the culture had changed. The idealism of the early raves, the sense of creating an alternative society, had been diluted by commercialization and exhausted by law enforcement. Plur started to feel like a marketing slogan rather than a lived ethos. The communal ecstasy, Both the drug and the experience began to feel like a commodity you purchased, rather than something you collectively created. And yet, millions of people, particularly young people, continued to seek out that experience. That feeling of connection and transcendence that ecstasy at its best could provide. The demand did not diminish. If anything, it grew. And where there is demand, supply will follow, no matter how illegal, how dangerous, or how adulterated the product becomes. While ravers danced and law enforcement cracked down, a quieter battle was being waged in laboratories and academic journals. The question at the heart of it was deceptively simple. Is MDMA dangerous? The answer, as it turned out, was far more complicated than either side wanted to admit. After MDMA was placed in Schedule 1 in 1988, research became extraordinarily difficult. Schedule 1 classification means the government has declared a substance has no medical value, which creates a bureaucratic and financial catch-22. To prove medical value, you need to conduct research. But to conduct research on a schedulized substance, you need to navigate a labyrinth of regulatory approvals, security requirements, and funding. For over a decade, research on MDMA in humans was essentially frozen. The research that did occur in the 1990s and early 2000s focused largely on toxicity, specifically neurotoxicity, the potential for MDMA to cause lasting damage to the brain. The concern was not unfounded. MDMA's mechanism of action made it plausible. The drug works primarily by causing a massive release of serotonin, a neurotransmitter involved in mood regulation, and to a lesser extent, dopamine and norepinephrine. Serotonin is stored in tiny vesicles inside nerve terminals, and MDMA essentially forces these vesicles to dump their contents all at once. This flood of serotonin is what creates the feelings of euphoria, empathy, and emotional openness. But there's a cost. The nerve cells that release serotonin neurons, can be damaged by the process. Animal studies, primarily in rats and primates, showed that high or repeated doses of MDMA could cause degeneration of serotonin nerve terminals. The delicate axon fibers that extend from serotonin-producing neurons. The damage appeared to be dose-dependent and disturbingly seemed to be long-lasting, though whether it was permanent was unclear. These studies were alarming, and they were widely publicized. The message from the anti-drug establishment was clear. Ecstasy causes brain damage. One dose could permanently destroy your serotonin system, leading to depression, memory problems, and cognitive impairment. This became the official narrative, repeated in DARE programs, in public service announcements, and in congressional hearings. But the story was not nearly that simple. And as more research accumulated, a more nuanced picture emerged, one that the simplistic brain damage narrative obscured. First, there was the problem of dose. The animal studies used doses of MDMA that, when scaled for body weight, were far higher than what human recreational users typically consumed. A rat might be injected with the equivalent of taking 10 or 20 pills in rapid succession. These were not realistic use patterns. When researchers used doses closer to actual human recreational use, the neurotoxic effects were less dramatic and often reversible. Second, there was the problem of species differences. Rats, it turned out, metabolize MDMA differently than humans and are more susceptible to hypothermia, overheating, which itself can cause neuronal damage. Primates seemed more resilient, and humans, based on the limited data available, appeared to be somewhere in between. Third, and most embarrassingly, one of the most influential studies claiming severe neurotoxicity in primates turned out to be based on a catastrophic error. In 2002, Dr. George Ricourt of Johns Hopkins University published a paper in the prestigious journal Science, claiming that even a single recreational dose of MDMA caused severe damage to dopamine neurons, the type of neurons that degenerate in Parkinson's disease. The implications were terror, and the study was widely cited as definitive proof of MDMA's dangers. There was just one problem. Record's lab had made a mistake. The vials they thought contained MDMA actually contained methamphetamine, a drug known to be highly neurotoxic to dopamine neurons. When the error was discovered, the paper was retracted in 2003. But the damage to MDMA's reputation had been done. Human studies, when they were finally conducted, painted a complex picture. Long-term heavy users of ecstasy, people who had taken hundreds of pills over years, did show some differences in brain imaging and cognitive testing compared to non-users. They had lower density of serotonin transporters, a marker of serotonin neuron health, and they performed slightly worse on certain memory tests, particularly verbal memory. But even here, the effects were subtle, far less dramatic than the brain damage rhetoric suggested, and it was impossible to disentangle the effects of MDMA from the effects of polydrug use. Since heavy ecstasy users often also used cannabis, alcohol, cocaine, and other substances, moderate users, people who took ecstasy occasionally, showed little to no detectable difference from non-users. The data suggested that if there was neurotoxicity, it was dose-dependent, possibly cumulative, and might be at least partially reversible if you stopped. But perhaps the most important finding was that MDMA's dangers, when they did occur, were often not from the drug itself, but from the context of its use and its prohibition. Deaths from ecstasy were rare, and when they occurred, they were usually due to hypothermia and dehydration, easily preventable with access to water and cool-down spaces. Hyponatremia from overhydration, pre-existing heart conditions, or most commonly adulterated pills that contain dangerous combinations of other drugs. The actual LD50 of pure MDMA, the dose at which 50% of subjects would die, is quite high relative to recreational doses.